Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today we're going to talk about something that can be very difficult for people. And that is the idea of having both boundaries and empathy. What does it mean to be both empathetic and have boundaries? Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
Friends, welcome back. I hope your day's going well wherever you are. Today we're just going to jump right into it. No reading from any of my email inboxes this week. I want to talk today about how we have kind of taken empathy and we've run it to places that isn't helpful. I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but we're going to talk more about today this world that people tend to live in where they feel like they have two choices, right? They can either be kind and flexible, or they can be firm and be cold, harsh, or selfish. In other words, it's almost as if we've come to this place in society where we don't believe you can have boundaries and be empathetic. And I think that is not helpful at all. I don't think it's actually true to what empathy is. And I think it actually hurts the people who are trying to live out with empathy, but it also hurts the people that we're living that empathy out to. And I think that's one of the things that makes this so difficult, because what that is that's a false binary. By the way, I love that word. I love binary. I also love the term bifurcation. If something is a false binary, that means we falsely bifurcated it. You can look that up. It's a ton of fun. I like words. Empathy is about understanding. Boundaries are about responsibility. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you know that I believe boundaries are not for the other person. They're for you, or they're for me, right? So my boundaries aren't for you. You're free to do whatever you want, but I may not participate with you. And here's the thing about empathy. I can feel your feelings to some level. I can understand maybe the situation you're in. I can understand how you came to the conclusion to make the choices that you're making, but that doesn't mean I have to participate. I can still have boundaries and be empathetic because they're not enemies, they're partners. They are not opposites, they are parallels. And I need them just like I need oxygen and a fuel source to have a nice campfire. It's middle of February and I'm cold and I'm thinking about campfires and camping this summer. So this episode might have a lot of those types of illustrations in it. But I need both of those to have a good experience. I need both of those, both empathy and boundaries, to live in a way that is healthy in 2026. Now, sometimes we get that a little sideways because we think that they're about the same person. Where boundaries are about me, empathy is about the other person, right? And so when I have empathy, but I think what empathy is agreement, I'm actually harming the other person. But when I have boundaries, but I think boundaries are about being cruel or excessive or somehow punishing the other person, then I've run away from boundaries and I'm avoiding responsibility because I have a responsibility to act in an appropriate way. I tell my clients all the time, I did an episode on this many months ago, maybe even a year or 2 years ago. We have expectations and acceptance backwards in our society. We tend to think that we should have expectations of other people first, when in reality, what we should do is we should have expectations of ourselves first and acceptance of others first. Now, what I mean by acceptance there is not affirmation that everything they're doing is okay. It's not affirmation that everything they're doing is right, or that we have to tolerate everything they're doing. But we have to accept that that's where they are and then proceed from there. So the person who's engaging in destructive behavior, I need to accept that that's where they're at, that they are currently engaging in destructive behavior. And then I move forward from there into a healthy way. And I can do that with both empathy, trying to feel what they're feeling, trying to understand what it is that they're going through, and still have boundaries, because even with understanding of what they're going through, I may not actually be able to participate because their behaviors as a result of what they're going through may actually be very unhealthy, not only for themselves, but for me to participate in. And so I might need to draw that boundary in a way that is, it can be painful. And I think that's part of the problem, is we get stuck thinking that anything we do that is painful, either for ourselves or for other people, that it's wrong. And that kind of goes back to a conversation we had a few weeks ago, How do we know if we've had a good conversation? We could spin that out a little bit further. How do we know if we have made a good decision on our behaviors? Because ultimately, that is what this comes down to, right? If we feel like we need to apologize, then we've done something wrong. And sometimes people are like, well, no, I don't feel like I did anything wrong, but they were hurt. Okay, well, if you're apologizing, that's saying I did something wrong. And if you did that, then you need to say that. What I want to talk about today, though, is how do we engage in both empathy and boundaries? How do we hold both without apologizing? And I think let's just start with, a lot of people think that saying no automatically makes them unkind. In part because we have been taught to, well, how would you feel if somebody said no to you? And none of us, when we run that out, think, oh, well, I'm happy that somebody told me no. Maybe none of us is a little too universal. But we're not typically happy when somebody's like, no, I can't do that. And yet, that happens. And sometimes, hopefully, most of the time, we're okay with that. But a lot of times, here's a good question. Do you find yourself over-explaining a lot? Do you find yourself softening what you're saying because you want to make sure that they're doing it, they're taking it exactly the way so that they don't feel bad? Are you delaying getting into a difficult conversation with something else we're going to talk about eventually? Are you delaying the difficult conversation that you know you need to have because you don't want the other person to feel hurt? So you know you need to have a conversation about boundaries, but maybe you're not doing it because you don't want them to feel negative in either some way about themselves or about you. Usually when that happens, when we are over-explaining, when we soften what we're saying, when we delay what we know needs to be said, often what happens is we end up resenting. And one of the things I talk to clients a lot about is you can't say yes and then resent. You can't say no and then resent. I mean, you can, but it's not a healthy way to live. Because you can still be empathetic and say no. You can care deeply and still refuse to participate. And I think this is a very difficult way because we've really gone places with empathy in the modern society that just the word shouldn't mean. And you can do both of those things. If you can't be empathetic and still say no, something is off, and only you have the power to change it in your life. Because here's something, let's talk about what empathy is and is not. Empathy is not agreement. Empathy is not fixing. Empathy is not rescuing. It's not carrying around someone's emotional load. And I think a lot of times that's what we have somehow created it to be. If you're not into my blog, Emotionally Inclined, that you can find at iamjoemartino.substack.com or just joemartino.com, and then click on Emotionally Inclined. I talk about how one of the things that we're doing, a couple posts there, I talk about how we are hijacking what it means to live with people into this idea that I have to carry your load with me. That's not healthy. And I know that goes against the modern mantra, the modern sermons of secular sermons, by the way, of empathy, but it just isn't. Empathy is accurately understanding another person's experience to the best that I'm able. Accuracy is naming it clearly. I talk about this a lot. Name it and get out in front of it. Just name it. Yep. You know what? I would imagine you are feeling this, but here's the bind we're in on that. We often tell people you're not allowed to address something you haven't experienced, which seems really backwards to me. But we can understand what another person's going through. In other words, if they're hurt, we can understand that they're hurt. Hey, I'm not going to participate in this. I can understand that that's hurtful. That's empathy. It's also a boundary because we can let it exist without trying to erase it. And a lot of times, maybe what has happened in the past is people have said things like, well, I can understand why you're hurt, but you shouldn't be. And we tell people how they should or shouldn't feel. I worry a little bit that we've come the other way. And now what we do is we tell them that you have to feel something. If you don't feel this, you're the problem. You can't be a good person and not feel what I'm feeling in this moment. And you can see this around almost all of the current political debates. I'm not here to get into those, but you can certainly see that reasoning and that expression of reasoning through almost everything that we are debating in modern society. You can say something along the lines of, I understand why this hurts, without saying to someone, so I'll do what you want, or I will affirm what you want me to affirm. I will say you were right in this when I don't think you were. And that's okay, right? One of the things that happens is empathy answers the question of, do I see you? Do I see the other people around me? Do I see the people that live around me? Do I see the people that I'm in community with? That's the question that empathy should be designed to try to answer. And then boundaries ask the question, what am I responsible for? Not you, like you get to choose, and I can invite you to different choices, but what am I responsible for? And this is where we get it mixed up, because a lot of times what we do in our modern expression of empathy is we assign responsibility to people, stuff that they're not responsible for, and we get mad if they hold a strong line on that. And that can become very, very troublesome in building relationships. It can become troublesome in emotional health. Because if you're responsible for emotions, my emotions, if I'm holding you responsible for things that you're not responsible for, such as my emotions, then you had better change, because if you don't, then you're hurting me and you're creating my emotions. And what happens if the thing that I want you to do isn't healthy for you or for me or maybe for both of us? And we often are not in a place where we have the opportunity to have those conversations, because they get shut down, because we've hijacked empathy to mean no boundaries, no responsibility. In so doing, we have essentially created a culture of people pleasers. We have created a culture of people that have to please other people, or they feel like they're not being empathetic. And let's be honest, empathy is very much a deity in our culture. Empathy is very much a deity in almost all of our society. And if you're if you're not satisfying the deity, you're in trouble. And I want to be clear, I'm not arguing against empathy here. Paul Bloom has an excellent book out called Against Empathy that I think everyone should read, because he is going to challenge a lot of the modern movement around empathy, and he's going to challenge every person who reads it. If they just give it a read through and digest the material, he's going to give them things to chew on. And maybe they come out disagreeing with them, but at least it gives you the opportunity to wrestle through some things that maybe right now you're assuming about empathy without actually having asked yourself, why do I assume this? Which leads to the question, because if we're creating this world of people pleasers, and I think by and large, we are especially teaching our children that people pleasing is the thing that matters. What happens then is saying no can feel threatening. Saying no feels threatening for a ton of reasons. A lot of people are afraid of saying no. Most people maybe. They're afraid of what saying no might cost them. And that is something we have to consider. They're literally afraid that if they say no, there's going to be a cost that just doesn't match what's going on. And so maybe the cost is disapproval. Like, hey, don't you agree with me on this hot button issue? No. Well, now we can't be friends. You and I cannot be friends. We're going to have conflict, because not only can we not be friends, but I'm going to have to put you on blast, because how else will I signal my moral virtue? How else will I signal my virtue if I don't put you on blast for not agreeing with me, for not doing what I wanted you to do? People who say no are often afraid of being misunderstood. I cannot tell you how often I hear people tell me, well, I just don't know how to make them understand what I'm trying to say. And of course, the problem with that is you can't make other people understand anything. You can't make other people understand anything. I'm going to say it one more time for the people in the back. You cannot make other people understand anything. So what happens is we become misunderstood. We're caught in conflict. We receive other people's disapproval. Sometimes we're publicly attacked verbally, sometimes maybe physically, but there is this ostracization. We're ostracized. I'm not quite sure what the correct form of that would be there that I messed up. And then what happens is you have guilt. You feel bad. I was just talking to a guy this morning who was talking about work, and he was talking about a phone call he was on at work where a person was stopping a product release that needed to happen, that they had promised would happen. All of the criteria had been met to release it. And they just kept pushing and kept saying things that weren't accurate. And he kept pushing back and pushing back and pushing back. And he told me, he's like, I lost sleep over it. That's the definition of guilt. He felt guilty because he passionately stood up for what he knew was accurate. And later it was proven that what he said was true. And then when you run all of that out, when you get even further into this, when you run past those barriers, one of the biggest barriers to saying no is a lot of people, they're afraid that they'll lose their identity. The nice one, the helper, the dependable one, right? Like these labels that we take as our identity, and we start to run out. And what happens? We trade honesty for harmony. We say, okay, I can't be honest, so I'll say yes because I don't want them to be mad at me. I don't want them to feel hurt. I don't want them to think something that isn't true. Okay, but is that their responsibility or your responsibility? Well, but if I say no, they might feel blah, blah, blah. And you'll see this a lot. And what happens is when you trade honesty for harmony, when harmony becomes the goal, or you'll see this a lot of times, unity, right? Well, I see this a lot with my faith-based friends. Well, we have to have unity. Yeah, true. We do. But unity doesn't seem to mean what you're saying it means when you're in the Bible. In fact, if you're interested in things like that, my daughter and I have a podcast that's going to be coming out called Hiding Behind God. On this podcast, the Joe Martino Show, where I just kind of talk to you, the Hiding Behind God podcast, my daughter and I talk together. We talk to each other. We talk to you. We haven't gotten to guests yet, but it hasn't gone live yet. We are, I think, 6, 7, 8 episodes in, trying to get quite a few of those recorded so that we can be set up for success. If you're interested in following that, be sure to check out my Substack, hidingbehindgod.substack.com. Right, and so when we start to run into these things, we're trading truth for unity, right? And when my church friends will be like, "Oh, well, we have to be unified." Yep, all I did was question you, and I'm not even saying me, but right, you were questioned. That doesn't mean there wasn't unity there. Here's what happens: people start to resent the people they're air quotes being kind to, and I want to be blatantly clear on this. If you're resenting someone because you didn't tell them the truth, that's on you. Resentment is a choice. However, it's not just as simple as, well, then just stop resenting people. What we need to do is we need to move further beyond that, because resentment is data, right? We talked about this in a couple other episodes. Emotions are data. They shouldn't be the steering wheel, but they do let you know it's raining out. They do let you know the sun's out. They let you know how your body is reacting, and how your body is reacting lets you know what you actually think about a situation. And so usually when we have resentment, it is because we didn't enforce a boundary and we expected the other person to act as though the boundary was put in place. We expected the other person to live in such a way as though we told them what the boundary was without actually telling them what the boundary was. And that is backwards to what is healthy. That is backwards to what we need to get done in society to be healthy people. We have to tell them, this is the boundary. This is the way that if you're going to participate with me, that we have to do it. And if you don't want to, that's totally fine, but I'm not going to participate in that. And then I don't have any room for resentment, because I'm not participating in something that I don't want to participate in. And you'll hear this in people's language. Well, I had to, I was forced to. I'll never forget a conversation where I had with a guy, not a client, so I can tell you his name and his address and all the stuff that I can't tell you because of HIPAA, but I had a conversation with a guy who was very resentful with his wife over the amount of money that she was spending on jewelry and the amount of money that she wanted him to spend on jewelry. And he was just really like, we just can't afford this. It's too much money, all the things. And I was like, well, then have you talked to her about it? He's like, well, no, I can't. Well, why not? Well, because she might not understand. Okay, so you're actively choosing to not talk to her about it. Here's what he said to me. He said, yes, I am, because she was accustomed to that life, that level of jewelry, that cost of jewelry, with her first husband, who passed away, right? And his wife passed away, and that's how they met each other in a grief group, which is fine. But I was like, okay, so then you're making the choice not to tell her, so she's spending money in a way that she thinks is okay. You can't resent her for that. And he got really mad at me. And I was like, no, this is what boundaries are, right? So you have the empathy of understanding where she's coming from, but you don't have the courage to then talk to her about the new reality. And so what happens is you start to resent. Okay, so that's kind of where boundaries or empathy can go sideways. How about boundaries? Boundaries can go from firmness to coldness, because firmness is something along the lines of, you know what, I understand this matters to you, but I'm still not available to participate in it. I'm still not going to participate in it. Coldness, well, that's not my problem, or I forgot why that's my problem. And you know what? I actually really love that answer in my head. I love it because, okay, so why is that my problem that you have this issue that I don't have? And when you start to run that out, there's just the difference in words. Now, sometimes you can say to people, because you have that relational equity build up, like, okay, so, but that's your problem. It's not something I'm wrestling with. The difference isn't the word no. The difference is whether or not you can still stay emotionally present with the person that you're talking to. Can you still stay in a state where you can recognize their emotions, where you can name them, where you can address them without trying to fix them or compromise your own beliefs? Because coldness disconnects to avoid discomfort. A lot of times people who are considered, they just don't feel anything. That's not actually true. They do feel things. They just don't know how to feel them and actually operate. So they try to disconnect. They try to move away from it. And you can validate someone's feelings without validating their expectations. And I think this is one of the things that we can struggle with because, the overwhelming message in society is that you can only validate my feelings by validating what I expect, by only validating what I believe. You know what? And I'll just pick something ridiculous. If I meet someone who really feels like they're Superman, I can validate that they really feel that way without actually agreeing with them that they're Superman. And that's a little bit overstated, but you can work that backwards to other things. I can agree with someone. I can validate that they feel like they were wronged, while at the same time running the risk of walking them through the logic of maybe you weren't wronged. And that's where it gets very, very touchy for people, because often what happens is we want to disconnect from that discomfort. And firmness will stay connected, but it doesn't engage in self-betrayal. Because once the goal becomes, I don't want to feel the discomfort of whatever it is whatever the result might be of what I have to say, I'm either going to soft pedal it, which we talked about, or I'm going to come in too hard, right? And there's a lot of people that do this. They just come in and they'll set fire to everything because that is going to keep them from hurt. This would be my natural dysfunctional way to avoid discomfort. I will just come in guns blazing or sarcasm blazing. Now, we'd have to get into some of those terms and pull them apart. But for today, we need to really kind of live out this truth that you can validate how someone's feeling without condoning their behaviors, without condoning the beliefs that led them to those feelings. In fact, I would argue it's very important that you do that, because if you don't, you're not helping them. And you'll see this in some pretty common empathy traps. One of the most common empathy traps that I think you'll see are over-explanation. If you're over-explaining, you're probably not setting a boundary, you're setting a negotiation. A couple years ago, probably 3 years ago now, maybe 4, my daughter and I went to a dealership here in town to negotiate buying a truck. And they had some prices that they wanted that I didn't want to pay. And this is her first vehicle. It was her first time she bought a vehicle and got hit by a tractor, believe it or not. Tell me you live in the country without telling me you live in the country. Got hit by a tractor 2 weeks later. The car was totaled. And so what we're doing is, we're going into a dealership now because she doesn't have the money to buy a new car outright and she wants to negotiate out a price. And she wanted a truck and the price that they wanted wasn't something I was willing to pay. So we walked away and she's like, Dad, they're going to sell that to somebody else. I'm like, well, if they do, then we lose. I don't think they will, but if they do, we lost. I said, but here's the thing you have to understand. If you are bargaining or negotiating, you have to be able to walk away. If you're not doing that. You're bargaining, you're sort of begging. And so you have to be able to walk away. And when we start to talk about boundaries, when you give a boundary, you have to over-explain it. If it goes beyond like, hey, this is what's going on. I understand that this is important to you, but I'm not going to participate in it. And then you go into a long explanation, you're probably in a place emotionally that isn't healthy. At the very least, individually, maybe even with that person. So you might be what we call enmeshed, which is where your identity and their identity is so wrapped up, you don't know what's what. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that you don't explain yourself, but I do want to be clear. While explaining yourself, there has to be a limit to that. There has to be a time delay to it. And because what happens is when we over-explain, we get caught in emotional caretaking, right? Which is a fun way to say, I'm trying to manage your emotions. We could call that emotional management. I'm trying to manage how you feel about what's going on. And I can't own that. I cannot own how you feel about what's going on. And a lot of what we see today is the other side of this. We're telling people how they should feel. And if they don't feel that way, we're done with you, which you can do that. But to me, that's boundaries gone bad. That's boundaries gone a little too far, because I expect you to agree with me on everything. You can't be a one-issue voter, but if you're not voting the way I want you to on this issue, if you're not protesting the way I want you to on this issue, if you're not angry the way I want you to be on this issue, we can no longer be friends. You're emotional caretaking the other person. You're dealing with the other person's emotions as the litmus test for whether or not you can be involved in them or with them, or you're trying to keep them from being emotionally overwrought. You're responsible for how upset they are. And that just isn't how emotions work. I'm responsible for my emotions, not you. One of the biggest emotional empathy traps is delayed honesty. And you'll see this with parents and kids the most, but it's true with adults to adults. And it's something along the lines of, well, maybe. Saying maybe when you mean no is not kindness. It's avoidance with interest added. And you'll see it with parents. In fact, I have a list of ideas to flesh out for blog posts or podcast posts. And one of them that has gotten transferred probably 3 or 4 times from one list to the next list is, can we stop saying maybe or we'll see to our kids when what we really mean is no? We just don't want to deal with the emotional fallout of telling them no. But then that bleeds into adults. Well, I don't know. Let me think about it and I'll get back to you. What we really mean by that is, let me think about it. And what I mean by that is, I hope that you forget that I told you I'd get back to you and you don't ever bring it up to me again, so I don't have to worry about dealing with you again or hurting your feelings again. And so what happens is we start to get into this delayed empathy. So I want you to I'm going to take a second. I want you to hear those common empathy traps. And I want you to ask yourself, do I fall into any of these? And how often do I? The first one, overexplaining. The second one, emotional caretaking. The third one, delayed honesty. Do you fall into any of those traps? Do you find yourself falling into any of those traps? Because we're going to deal with what to do with them next. Because all of this does beg the question, what does healthy boundaries and empathy actually look like? What does healthy empathy plus boundaries look like? Let me just give you a few examples. Some things you could say. I can understand why you're disappointed. I get it. But I'm still not able to say yes. Right? We can, again, recognize and name their emotion, but still hold our boundary. I actually really care about you, but this isn't something I can take on. This is not something that I'm able to do right now. Again, affirming that we care about the person, affirming that we love them, but I'm not able to do that right now. I can understand your urgency right now. I can understand the urgency to get this done right now, but I don't have the time, or my answer is still no. In fact, we could probably just trim that one right down to, I can understand the urgency, but I'm still not able to say yes. I have to say no. And there's no apology for having limits. Now, we can nuance that out a little bit. I don't usually like when I say I can't say yes because I could clearly say yes. I will typically say I'm choosing not to say yes. And I might give a 1-sentence explanation. I don't know what I would take off my plate to do what you're asking me to do. I don't know what I would stop doing so that I could participate in what you're asking me to participate in. Now, that's more where we're not talking about something. Now, we go the other way. Hey, I can understand that this is something you're very passionate about. It's not something that I am as passionate about. And so I'm not going to participate in whatever it is. I'm not going to do this with you. Even if what you're asking me to do you feel is a moral issue, if I don't share that, I don't have to join you in that. And we don't have to have apology for having limits. We also don't attack them for wanting us to respond. We don't have to attack them for the other person for having more passion about something that we don't. We can even tell them, if you want, you could tell them that you think they're wrong. I don't know, there are situations where I could see that would be helpful, and there are situations where I could see that would not be helpful. This matters for emotional maturity, though, because emotionally mature people can tolerate 2 things at once. This is the big thing. If you've forgotten everything else, if you zoned out because you're cleaning or driving or working on a paper, whatever, give me a few seconds here and just zone in on this. Emotionally mature people can tolerate 2 things at once. Someone else's discomfort, that's thing 1, and their own integrity, that's thing 2. You can have empathy for someone else and still maintain your own integrity without attacking anybody. Now, they might feel attacked, but we're not going to emotionally caretake here. We're not going to manage their emotions. We're just going to live up to our integrity and be willing to name how we believe they're feeling. Because again, that is emotional maturity. And if that's emotional maturity, then emotional immaturity tries to eliminate one of those at all costs. Emotional immaturity will try to limit all of those at all costs. And again, you can see this in the modern political discourse. You're not allowed to say, you know what, when it comes to this person, this candidate, this president, this senator, this congressperson, I think that these policies were good and these policies were not good. It's interesting. Somebody said to me one time, oh, well, you clearly like so-and-so. And I was like, actually, no, I don't. But I do like probably half their policies. And that's a difference, right? I don't have to eliminate that two things can exist at once. I can wrestle with the truth that two things can exist at once. And that is really hard for many of us. Because if you cannot say no without shutting down emotionally, you're avoiding closeness. And a lot of times that's because closeness is uncomfortable. Closeness has discomfort with it. Closeness brings pain. But if you cannot say no without drowning in guilt, you're avoiding responsibility. You're too interested in protecting the relationship to the point that your relationship probably is not very healthy. Because if you can't say no, I don't know how you have an emotionally healthy relationship. Growth is learning to stay present in the tension of both of those things. And that's where it gets really, really difficult. I think this is part of the reason we have people like, I just have relationship burnout. Do you have relationship burnout, or do you just not know how to care for relationships in a way that respects boundaries and empathy, in a way that respects that you should not be their caretaker for their emotions. They should not be the caretaker for your emotions. When that shifts for people, they become healthy in a way that many people think is impossible. I've watched it happen. Which brings me kind of to my closing thoughts, which are empathy without boundaries does create burnout. Now, I think it creates burnout because you're actually not very healthy in how you are living in the boundaries, right? Or you're not very healthy in how you're living in the relationship. But boundaries without boundaries without empathy leads to isolation, which leads to, you guessed it, burnout. Because you don't have to choose between being kind and being honest. You don't have to choose between kindness and honesty. You just have to recognize both. You can have both. But if someone can only accept empathy when it comes to compliance, that's not connection, that's control. It's manipulation, right? That isn't a relationship. That's manipulation. If someone only wants you, like you have to agree with them, you have to do what they want you to do. You have to believe like they believe. You cannot disagree. You have to do it the way they want you to do. And I'll tell you one that's funny to me, and it's funny in an ironic way, not a ha-ha way. There's more than one way to load the dishwasher. I don't know if you know that or not, but there is. And I can already hear it. Somebody's going to email me. There is only one way to load my dishwasher. And that way is the only right way. Nope, hogwash. Now, your way may be the most efficient. It may be. What's really interesting is because you think that doesn't mean that it's so. And your spouse can be like, okay, I'll load the dishwasher, but I don't agree with you. That's okay. Because here's the other thing. When you start to walk this out, what's one of the ways that this happens, that you see these empathy traps show up, you see these boundary traps show up, what happens sometimes is people want the people in their life to not only do the thing that they want them to do, they want them to want to do it. And that is not emotionally healthy. You can have boundaries, you can have empathy, but you can't major on one to the exclusion of the other. When you do that, you lose out on emotional health. And when you lose out on emotional health, the relationship ends up dying anyhow. You're not unkind because you have limits. You're not loving just because you say yes. And I think that's part of the problem. We've got to realize that there's tension there. You could actually be saying yes because you're the end beneficiary of why you're saying yes. Empathy means I see you. Boundaries mean I stay honest while seeing you. If you keep confusing compassion with compliance, or if you let other people who confuse compassion with compliance dictate the rightness or wrongness of what you're doing, you will eventually resent the very people that you were trying so hard to care for, and you will eventually lose the relationship anyway, because it will wither and die. It's just how life works, because resentment will cost you more than a clear no ever would. Once people are done being mad, emotionally healthy people appreciate knowing what the boundaries are. You can be present, you can be firm, and you can stop apologizing for being a whole person. That's my hope for today, that when you walk out of this, listening to this episode, you recognize that being a whole person, being wholehearted, requires that you are willing and able to recognize the people around you and what's going on with them, and at the same time, hold boundaries. That's not cold. It's healthy. All right. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.